You met me at a very Chinese time in my life. If you've spent any time on TikTok, Instagram or any other app of the moment, especially xinzhongshi, Red Note, you've heard this phrase. It's the anthem of China maxing, the viral obsession with modern Chinese lifestyle, infrastructure and specifically fashion. Today we're doing a deep dive into the cultural anthropology of this trend. We're using the viral Adidas tongue jackets as our hook to explore how soft power is shifting, how tradition is being invented, and why your favorite influencers are suddenly drinking hot water and, supposedly anyways, boiling apples. Let's talk about the artifact. The Adidas tongue jacket, aka Chinese New Year's drag jacket. Why did this garment break the internet? It's a reimagining of the traditional tangzhuang, a garment with roots in the Qing dynasty. But it's not a costume, it's part of the Neo-Chinese style or xinzhongshi movement. Adidas paired their iconic 3 stripes with panko, those knot buttons that represent harmony and fortune. It's designed by Adidas China team and for the Chinese market, at least originally, and have also been collaborative pieces done with designers like Shenzhen-born Samuel Guiyang and the creative polymath Edison Chen. These jackets are hopefully more than just seasonal trend pieces of the moment. Or maybe the jackets themselves should be just trend pieces, but what they stand for ultimately should go on a bit more. Right now, it's just a China piece that found popularity first with the 2025 Chinese New Year and went on to global notoriety now around the time of the 2026 Chinese New Year, the beginning of the Year of the Horse. It's no longer China exclusive, it's also seeing drops in Europe and currently the USA, but in limited numbers and with a lot of hype marketing around it. But then, it's also a definitive signal of Guochao 3.0. That's the national wave Guochao, where heritage becomes foundational to lifestyle. For over a century now, cool came from the West, but the primary source of global cool is shifting eastward. The jacket that I'm wearing is the Chinese New Year Adidas jacket's less well-known, less hyped counterpart, the Adidas X Cloth drag jacket designed by Edison Chen. This is even more of an East-West piece as it shows the hand of its designer Edison Chen, who was originally known as an actor, then turned designer of streetwear stuff with his brand Cloth, and who is thus himself a representative of the global Chinese or Chinese global diaspora. Now, the fashion part, the product part itself, is an interesting object for a cultural anthropology lens. Material culture isn't often a part of anthropology anymore, given how globalized the products of industrial culture have become. All too often, young people everywhere wear the same uniform of jeans and t-shirts. In the current generation Z and Alpha, this may be changing to jogging suits, but it's still all pretty uniform. And we don't have to just bash younger generations. Look at white-collar professionals everywhere, and you will likely see suits everywhere. The uniform and the uniformity are pretty universal there too, with some differences as usual, but none that concern us at the moment. The times when different peoples were distinguishable through the clothing they wore, their traditional costumes, are most definitely over, at least outside of some special circumstances. In the tongue drag jackets, however, we find a peculiar anthropological object that is coded as Chinese through select elements. They have usually some kind of a stand-up Mandarin collar and those panko frog buttons of tangzhuang, of tongue clothing. They were, however, designed by a global brand, but with a local audience in mind and as the intended audience, as the buyers. As usual with material culture, things get more complicated when you look more closely. You can now find many articles telling you about the Adidas drag jackets as belonging to tangzhuang, a style of clothing harkening back to China's Tang dynasty, one of the high points, the golden ages, in its long and storied history. This was, for example, the dynasty during which the Silk Road trade and the spread of arts and ideas and religions that went with it was in full swing. But, of course, you do not actually see clothing that's coming from a dynasty that ruled from 618 to 907 CE. Rather, the Tangzhang style is a Chinese-invented tradition of the late Qing dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty, which was not actually led by the Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group in China, but by the Manchu, which you might know as Manchu. If you really wanted to play or perhaps cosplay Chinese, you should actually use Hanfu, Han Chinese dress from before the Qing dynasty. This did have some popularity in China, but it's at least as conspicuous as wearing a kimono is in Japan, let alone anywhere else. There were Chinese in China who did that and felt pride for it, but it's certainly nothing that would have spread anywhere else. It would have been just too special, too peculiar. These not really tongue jackets are more akin to Asian or Chinese chic that had seen some popularity before, that inspired Western designers in earlier times as well. It's just a little bit of something exotic, but easy enough to adopt. And things are still different nowadays. After all, these Asian elements now also inspire Asian designers, and they are being used by Asian brands. In China, they are, at least to some extent, a representation of the rather recent national wave, Guochao, which we mentioned before. This has gone through 3 different phases itself, and it has gone interestingly. Phase 1, around circa 2010, there was some simple nostalgia for retro touristic brands. White Rabbit Candy, for example, had its time, its popularity. Then, circa 2019, came Pride in Made in China. Li Ning presented a collection at New York Fashion Week, and of course we've seen the rise in Chinese electronics brands. DJI drones. Whenever someone complains about Chinese stuff currently, I feel like I'm in Back to the Future. I see Back to the Future again, when Doc says, looking at the time machine, I see the problem. This piece says made in Japan. And Marty comes back puzzled with, are there good electronics made in Japan? Now we're seeing a lot of things like this with China. Still a lot of complaints about bad stuff, but actually a lot of good stuff. Recently, Guochao has found its way into what is now called xinzhongshi, the new Chinese style, which aspects of cultural heritage, a sort of national historical IP, intellectual property, is getting recognized as sophisticated design and upheld as modern, cool, fashionable. A label, a term to know, is also that of zixin, of cultural confidence in oneself, one's country. This too has risen. China's own luxury brands are developing with this, and global luxury powerhouses cannot just produce for a general global audience anymore. They also need to understand and take into account local concerns too. With the Chinese New Year, Year of the Horse, we have seen a lot of that, of collaborations for products which are meant for the Chinese market. That said, the global adoption of a China look and of Chinese habits that we're currently seeing is a different beast again. In daily life in China, surprise, you don't have to look Chinese in your clothing or some such in order to be Chinese, if that's what you are. In fact, if you look Chinese and you dress in Tangzhuang or Hanfu, you'll probably make people wonder why you're trying so hard, what sort of statement you're trying to make. With me, well, some elements of Chinese dress are okay, but my wife actually has big problems with this jacket. She doesn't like its stylistic origins in the late Qing, which was not a good time for China. For example, she says that it kind of keeps the breast and the belly too open, which is not good for clothing. She hates it. There are aspects of cultural appropriation to it too, but also in such a way that we have to wonder who is being appropriated, not just what. So it's time to turn to this idea of China maxing. The term is a portmanteau of China, obviously, and this internet suffix maxing, which originates from gaming and specific male-dominated subcultures like looks maxing or height maxing. In the context of maxing, an individual seeks to optimize or maximize a specific physical or social attribute to its extreme potential. A jawline, a strong one, for example. When applied to China maxing, the term describes an intentional and admittedly often humorous, but also somehow deeply aspirational immersion into a Chinese-coded lifestyle. But why are young Westerners maxing their Chineseness? What sense does it make? UCLA researcher Caroline Willett in Time magazine suggests we are engaging with a hyper-real China, a really symbolic version that absorbs everything that Americans fear that they are losing: community, structure, competence, limits, cultural continuity, and care for elders. By contrast, today's China, I quote, feels contemporary, dynamic, even aspirational in certain ways. On our screens, we see high-speed trains that actually work. High-speed rail is a big issue in those things about China. We see walkable cities, which is a bit of a misunderstanding, but sometimes also really is true. And we certainly see a sense of community that feels missing in the West. For a generation burnt out by individualism and economic burnout, this perceived collectivism feels like a toolkit for survival. So you aren't just buying a jacket, you're performing a quiet rebellion against a system you feel isn't delivering. Maybe. This may seem like a strange use of the surface, of some surface elements of an other, of some signifiers of Chineseness. And it is. Joking viral memes aside, however, you are not becoming Chinese by doing any of that. You are, however, engaging with an anthropological other in a way that is actually very usual. You learn something of it, see something of it, and you use it for your own ends. The other here is not so much the object as it is the mirror for our own introspection. We see something that we aspire to and or something we feel that we have lost. We use our limited understanding of this other to present it as a criticism of our own. This is actually a tradition in philosophy and in cultural anthropology that's almost as old as contact with China. Enlightenment thinkers already had their moment in which China was a great example to them. However, in the 17th century, they thought of China as the paragon of enlightened rational governance, rules-based, law-based, philosophical. And then in the 18th century, they saw it suddenly as a stagnant and despotic society full of violence. This has worked more recently too. I still have a copy of an old world guide from my grandma's bookshelf. I kept the one volume about East Asia because I found it so fascinating. It introduces China as the clear, obvious example of the non-capitalist future that will obviously come about and be really great. Well, it's from the 1960s when Western subcultures protested the Vietnam War, Europe protested American dominance, and times in China were actually quite horrible. But people didn't really know that. They didn't see that. They saw a collectivism which seemed nice compared to the capitalist hyperdrive they thought they were seeing. Nowadays, however, we see a strange complication to stories about an anthropological other, such as China, because this other isn't just somewhere over there, far away, it's also here. Chinese products are all around us, whether Chinese made or also already Chinese designed. The current China maxing trend seems to have come about in large part because of all the TikTok refugees to xinzhongshi, to Red Note, who suddenly had contact with actual Chinese people and saw that things didn't actually look like politics would have led you to believe. And of course, Chinese people are here, and things are more complicated once again. For me, this is particularly complicated a topic because it concerns me personally, since my wife is Chinese and our daughters are recognizably of Asian Chinese background, but we live in the West. Our daughters are likely to be met with the same stereotypes that have been going around for way too long. My wife certainly feels them sometimes. And I can very well understand the Chinese diaspora people who wonder what to make of China maxing when they were looked at askance, if not outright attacked, only a few years ago. Remember COVID being labeled the China virus, bat soup being presented as the source of it all? And now, all of a sudden, Westerners want to eat raw rice porridge in the morning, and hot pot isn't the biggest weirdness, it's in every bigger city. There are few hot pot restaurants here in Vienna. Read any Chinese diaspora kids' comments, therefore, and they'll tell you how weird it feels. For many Chinese diaspora people who have written about it, they grew up being bullied for the very lunch and the very clothing that is now trendy, and the transition, of course, is jarring. They call out ethnic double standards. When a Chinese When a Chinese person wears a qipao, it's ethnic. When a Western influencer does it, it's a vibe. There's a term for this in anthropology from bell hooks, eating the other. It's when a dominant culture consumes parts of a marginalized culture to spice up their own life without ever seeing the people behind the practices. And so we do have to ask, is this genuine appreciation, or are we all just following a wellness trend of the week that will be discarded by next year? Is it, as many people have asked, cultural appropriation, or not really? Now, you may try to use the panko button as a signifier of an other that is appealing or at least deliciously rebellious to pledge allegiance to. I'm becoming more and more Chinese every day. It doesn't mean that you will become a member of the Chinese Communist Party. It's what Bella Dix calls culture on display, turning a heritage into a market product to create a sense of belonging in a globalized world. It's a weird belonging, however. If you are white, or for that matter, otherwise Westerner, anything non-Chinese really, you are Waiguoren, a foreigner to the Chinese. Even when you're not in China to the Chinese, you are a Waiguoren. Given the ethnic diversity and some of the history of China, you could be sort of considered Chinese if you speak the language, adhere to the rules, legal and unspoken. You can find some acceptance, especially given enough evident appreciation for China, and you still remain foreign as well. At the very least, there's usually little concern about cultural appropriation in China. You can try out whatever you want to wear, but it's in part because getting into some ethnic national costume is a part of tourism, for example, and it's something you can do as a foreigner because you don't belong, and so you don't have the same kinds of obligations anyways. Chinese New Year having just come around, this whole topic makes me think of the issue of Hongbao. In all the discussions of Chinese things, these red envelopes for gifting cash are sometimes mentioned. Not often, rarely, but sometimes. But they are a good example of signifier versus thick description, of practice versus meaning. If you think it's just a gesture of goodwill or well-wishing to give money and the cultural wrapping of it is just that it would be in a red envelope, well, you'd only be seeing the tip of that iceberg, the surface level that's above the water, not the big thing underneath. Because actually, it's not a gift so much as a gesture which is made in order to reinforce mutual connections. Chinese people, parents especially, will keep exact track of who has given how much, because it's important that you reciprocate in kind. And in kind, it can be kindness to help with less expectation of getting the money back, to help poorer family members. But usually in kind means with the exact same amounts, at least over time, when somebody else also has kids, for example. It's all of it is a weird thing, but also one that fits in with how culture does seem to operate. Material elements of culture can spread pretty wide and far. Ideas can spread, but are often reinterpreted as they get to new contexts. Social relationships are a different matter, where culture is material in a separate way and ideological in a way that is meant to be spread, it seems, not just to be transmitted across generations of the same groups of people. Societies also define themselves through biological relations. Currently, certainly, we're in a time when ethnic nationalism still holds its way. Chinese blood makes you Chinese, even if you never learned the language or the social rules and norms. Same as racial thinking makes American conservatives equal whiteness with Americanness. It's actually a kind of racism, but it's also something that we all have in us to some extent. But of course, we're also seeing enough group belonging where what you believe is the stronger determinant. Just think, for example, of religions, or your support for sports teams for that matter. Finally, we should mention the geopolitics. Some see China maxing as a sort of political defection. In a time of global instability, China's high-tech infrastructure and perceived stability are looking pretty competitive. Have you heard of Zhang-Schmidt? That's the nickname that Chinese netizens have given to Donald Trump, sarcastically calling him the nation builder for inadvertently helping China's global standing, helping build a nation, because now there's more pressure towards being standing up for oneself, by itself. And of course, there is the national standing. This all isn't just a fashion trend, it's a soft power shift that Beijing could never have bought, but is certainly very happy to embrace. It's only been a few years since China was the source of the COVID pandemic and all economic trouble, it seemed, and pundits were sure that China would never achieve soft power like Japan's or Korea's because its government was just too heavy-handed in its approach to culture and cool. They just wanted to control too much. Well, how things have changed. Admittedly, it wasn't the Chinese government that changed it. It was Adidas, apparently, and TikTok or xinzhongshi. So, is China maxing the future of global youth culture? Is it just a Fight Club quote taken too far? I can't tell you that. I would not be surprised if the trend fizzled out within the next month already. China, however, will still be there, still be a fascinating world almost unto itself, but now with some more global appeal and also, therefore, unto us. We will visit family in China again this summer, let our girls practice their Chinese and see life there. And I should show more of life in China and finally finish revising my book about the cuisines and culture of the chiller pepper in China. I hope you'll learn more, with or without Tang Zhuang. Stay curious.